closed. How's everyone doing today?
Well,
Yes, yes. So many people braving the rain to be here for another Caffeinated Verse and our first of 2024. Today we have the wonderful Elena Karina Byrne, who is a fantastic poet I've known for, we were just discussing this, we're either 4 or 5 years, mainly through email correspondence, and Elena's also been an editor to many of my poems earlier on. And we met for the first time a year ago, I think, at Beyond Baroque, when you were reading with, I forget his name, John?
I don't remember what reading that was.
Yeah, you're reading all the time, I'm sure, but we met at a reading. John something, maybe it was a John, but it was a great reading. So, yeah, I would like to read Elena's bio, just to introduce her, and then we're going to listen to her wonderful poems and then have a Q&A after, before we open up and do the open mic. So, former 12-year regional director of the Poetry Society of America, Elena Karina Byrne curated programs for the GRI at the J. Paul Getty Center, MOCA, the Craft Contemporary Museum, Beyond Baroque Literary Arts Center, the Clark Library, the West Hollywood Book Fair, and USC's Dehaney Memorial Library, among others. She's a freelance editor, lecturer, programming consultant, and poetry stage manager for the Los Angeles Times Festival of Books, and literary programs director for the historic Ruskin Arts Club. A Pushcart Prize and Best American Poetry recipient, Elena served as a final judge for Penn's Best of the West Award for the 2016 to 2018 Kate and Kingsley Tufts Poetry Awards in Poetry, and as co-judge for the 2022 International Laurel Prize, an annual award for the best collection of nature or environmental poetry. Her 5 poetry collections include If This Makes You Nervous, Omnidorm Publishing 2021. As this illustrious list makes me nervous. Her poems, reviews, essays, and interviews can be found in Poetry, the Kenyon Review, the Paris Review, Academy of American Poets Poem a Day, Poetry Daily, Verse Daily, New American Writing, APR, Plume and Plume Anthologies, Los Angeles Review of Books, Real Verse, Poems About the Movies, Republic of Apples, Democracy of Oranges, New Eco-Poetry from China and the United States, The Eloquent Poem, 128 Contemporary Poems and Their Making, Bomb, and Elsewhere. Elena's now writing screenplays while completing a collection of essays entitled Voyeur Hour, Poetry, Art, Film and Desire. Now, after that lengthy introduction, let us welcome Elena to the microphone.
Are you exhausted?
Oh,
wait.
Need your poems.
Yeah, Nathan and I had a wonderful correspondence, and you know, it's interesting because you meet someone even on Zoom, and it's not the same as in person. So it was really a delight to know him in person. I lived in England when I was 14 for a year in London, and then in Bath for 7 years, where I met my now ex-husband. And so I have a great affinity with, you know, I'm definitely an Anglophile in a lot of ways, and I love everything, you know, masterpiece theater, all of that. And that's, I guess I'm going to segue to that by saying that I've always believed that there's a very important interrelationship between poetry and film, and not just because they're visual mediums, but there's something about the process of how we approach our poems, process of seeing, all of that. And so I recently taught a 10-week class using a lot of filmmaking terminology to apply to poetry. Anyway, that's all I'll say. So as a poet, you always want to challenge yourself. So I feel like every book, I think I've succeeded to making every book different, and now I'm really challenging myself. It's my father, who was a famous art teacher, used to say, he said, if you get into a habit, make yourself uncomfortable. So I've been making myself uncomfortable by writing as best I can, slightly more narrative poem and poems about real life. So that's mostly what I'm going to read today. Now I'm going to turn on my little timer. I'm going to read 2 poems from If This Makes You Nervous, which is an entire book of, ekphrastic book, in response to art. And then I'm going to read some new poems. So, okay. Thank you, Nathan, for all of that.
Use the mic as well. So
Yeah. Let's see how to do this. How's that? All right. I'm going to start with an Ars Poetica, poem about writing poetry. I don't make the rules. When dusk makes a break for it alone, and after a lie has been told to you so many times you forget your own name, a man appears in a tuxedo, opens the glass door to say, welcome, welcome, without smiling as he looks over your shoulder. I turn around too, since this is a motel and not a restaurant. The parking lot's almost as empty as my exhaustion, so I decide to stay and say nothing in case he has a gun and a mind for all-nighters. I say this to you because the floor smells like old beer and grief. Once he hands me my door key, I see a rat make himself at home behind the candy dispenser down the hall. Now I wonder what lives behind the ice machine that lights up at night like the one blue eye of hell as you lift open its tiny kiln-like door before reaching in with that small shovel tied to its black watch chain. I will anticipate the smell of cigarette smoke coming through the bathroom vent from the next room just after a couple has turned their sprung bed into a comedy store of errors between their separate marriages. This makes it easy to invade their space, raising the volume on the TV. After all, I'll find nothing worth watching but for the Dungeons and Dragons cop show, where the villain is an orphan girl who gets bloodied but free in one fell swoop, but not without the cliche of falling in love with the wrong side of the bed. I'm going to take a page out of Galway Canal's way of reading, which is to say, save your applause for the end, because some poems don't get as much applause and then they're sad. This is Portuguese Band. I lived in the Portuguese Band Club, where we had a house in the Portuguese Band Club from the time I was 4. I woke up one morning at 9 and went down to the beach, and this is what I saw. How could you have known that childhood stopped there, where seawater was once feather weightless as a philo-plume murmur of longing? As white morning skies fog came down, drifting over the shoreline to ghost above one dead whale, beached and flightless. Or that emerging from the cliff's brittle sagebrush, I saw them, 4 nuns in black habit, arms outspread upon the oiled black wall of him, as if to find the final bellow of his voice. Women fathomed in their purpose, their winged prayer for his missing wind instrument. How they would ask their God for something recovered of him. I could not have taken the sight for granted, but I didn't know the difference between what was real and my 9-year-old need for this reprieve. Time that brought the cathedral sound of waves into my room betrayed no one. From the full landscape of his heaved body, I believed all incoming hours paused, like the evidence left behind, like with my mother, with gesso paint on her hands in the parentheses of a nightgown. or father stacking books instead of cans of food before a war, brother rubbing and rubbing the carpet hard for sparks so he could see. What causes us to live, I cannot say. Scientists came to cut a piece of the whale. Seabirds' hollow quills, feet, and beaks skirted away some of the open window wounds. The gull's rhythmed alarm calls came over his hard, barnacled, and beautiful body that remained there for days until we couldn't be an audience. He must have weighed the same as too many feathers, or the crushed brine under Earth's seam. Because I did not know how to speak about this to myself, because in remorse, there's always an interval between voice and consequence, the unforeseen breach. So this next poem is about, my mother was really loving, and she was also very driven by fear. And so when I became a teenager, she was certain that I could be kidnapped, and so I think that's all I have to say. I'm using the title is an Emerson quote. All objects, all events are transparent. Fear was everywhere in my childhood. Lovely mother insisted, yell fire when you mean help. Run into the middle of the street. See your untied hair on fire, your aflame collar and cuffs seething with her smokescreen. Do you know your name, your home address, your homonym? I walked home the short way away from being kidnapped, for I was my own last chance to see my way out, she said. There's an accidental discipline of so many palm leaves on one tree. Believe. Looking back, you'll roll the dice more than once. When attacked, pretend you're crazy. Eat your shirt while humming the national anthem. Hate them back so you can gouge their eyes. Smash the Adam's apple as they pull you toward their bodies. Leap hard from the car like a stunt double and run again. Since most people can't shoot straight, can't tie their own shoes. Leave one shoe behind, the single crumb trail to who you still are when alive and a child. How the unseen air's wide open scaffolding has been taken down, and the fennel alongside the road will find you, even before you see them coming. For the workman who pressed his palm over my 11-year-old jean-covered sweet spot, as I fell, fast counting down the same set of minutes like some new infallible alphabet. He would not be alive were it not for his own fear engine read for fleeing. Unseen, because you are a female implied by desire and the wish to lose your form, you must take out your keys before leaving, the night in its dressing gown of disappearing things. From the next door neighbor's moss basement alone, I found my way free. I saw out of my friend's attic steamer trunk, beneath breath for breath without her help. I turned all dials back to ground zero, where a wristwatch could be crushed like an insect's carapace. My feet swept over burning coals every time a new man was out to get me in the dream. No one is safe, nothing is normal, as the mailman delivering news from the outside world's curtailed circus act. Closing in on morning's passing colors, the walls move like fish skin of water just before you'll wake to an earthquake. Hide under an open door, afraid of the invisible epigraph of a mother's last words falling around you like your trapped childhood, like death's rapid-fire clicks of her handheld camera. So, yeah, I'm trying to write about real life. This is the quote, the title is also by the author Hal Ackerman. Feeling a little nostalgia for a past that has never happened. My brother and I lived under the same roof, in the same house. In the same house, my brother and I lived different lives, with different parents who kept our languages apart. Languages apart, his part and mine, the bad boy, good girl game of chance. For whoever came to the party rattled the windows with their voices downstairs, with different parents, No one sees you in a game of chance. No one sees you in the hour of the never sleeping, of the ever sleeping. No one's child alone in each bed's boat is left unmoored, or sleeps unmoored in the dark's murmuring box of algorithms, the far-off clang and ring of a boy in a funeral of fog, nightlight obscured. Obscured as a nightlight, the truth. Different truths, 5 years apart. 5 years apart, vexed in the next room, we both heard laughter split the white wall between us like a wave, like only children can who can't sleep. Of the sleep in the next room, my brother and I yet saw the same house sail from us. Okay, let's see. 2 more. I think I'm just making it. This is, this is my ekphrastic poems are not about one specific painting. They're about sort of the oeuvre of the artist. I really immersed myself in each artist's work. A lot of these artists, especially the contemporary artists in the book, I knew or I'd met because my parents were artists. And I like to say I'm a poet because my parents were artists. This is called A Walkabout in Andrew Wyeth's painting, and it does reference something, again, that happened when I was 9. Before the squall hit, before 5 bodies' weight in boulders were thrown from the breakwater, we stood at the window. We lay calm on wood-colored beaches. Dreams don't sink children with a ship. Ships carrying other languages are found atop mountains in far countries. It's true. After giving her directions, I watched a car, the color of dusk, hit the woman crossing our street, and she sank at once, as if into a hole. I carried that hole in my stomach for years, a sinkhole also known as a swallow hole, a doline caused by some depression, by some form of ground collapse. In the 60s, TV was filled with them, on islands as quicksand in men's mouths, immolation fires, cadmium mist of protest. Films of ditches, war holes, numberless graves, unaccounted for. Running before a storm's roiling, I later learned how to jump wide spaces roof to roof. I believed the wet black head of a horse breathed desert clouds over my sleeping body. A child can be anyone, where sea waves can look like blown wheat, leveled by wind. At her end of the day, the long walk's wilderness rest. Okay, this is probably the most abstract of all the poems. My last poem was the first poem that I wrote for the book, If This Makes You Nervous. And I wrote it, way back, I think in 2018, something like that maybe. So my half-sister died when I was 9, and it really changed our family dynamic. It changed my perception as a child of the world, and so I've been writing. Every book has at least one poem about this. She was 26. She had 2 children, and I was 9. And I guess maybe that's all you need to know. So Rachel Whiteread is an amazing English artist who casts negative space under objects, like under the chair she would cast, or she'd cast under the table, or smaller spaces, and then she would do a whole roof. She does other things, but she did a lot of work with boxes and cardboard boxes as well. So I think that's enough.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and there's a little bit of a reference to people trying to get into our country by boat. Rachel Whiteread, it's so you could almost lick those sugar cubes stacked in sleep. Find the hexahedron arc floating today's ocean, missing its human animal, leaving home. Grief is an impression of a missing table floating out to sea. back up. Grief is an impression of a missing table under the table, a body that's departed and withdrawn from the body floating out to sea. The color of Halloween candy wrappers. I lived a whole afternoon under the leftover houseboards in our dying garden after my one sister died. Half-sister, half-death of my thinking about death at 9. A black hole can be measured by the sheer speed of what is orbiting around it. If you withdraw one object from its space in a room, measure what's left, all the empty parts, you have a child inside a box thinking outside of itself. Thank you.
See if we can get this off. Thank you so much, Elena. Can you get another round of applause for that? So, I have a few questions that I'm going to ask Elena, and then we're going to open it up to questions from all of you for whatever you have. And I think, first of all, I was writing down so many of your images and how they move and transform and how they feel like I can see them in scenes. So I can see the influence of film, especially in your newer poems, but generally. My first question, though, is about you grew up, with your parents as artists. In what way did that give you a vocabulary to explore poetry while dialoguing with art?
So for me, there's a twofold answer. Of course, you're immersed in your family dynamics and in your environment. So the environment of art definitely influenced me. It was so visual. We went to a lot of art openings. My parents weren't, by any stretch of the imagination, bohemian. My dad was 20 years older than my father. My father was 20 years older than my mother. But we were immersed in art. And he's a very famous drawing teacher who also taught Disney animators anatomy. So he was always talking about the relationship of drawing and the brain, and he was very interested in all of that. He was an autodidact. And when I was taken to these art shows, and a lot of them were performance art and conceptual art, contemporary art. Of course, as a child, you don't have a groundwork for that, understanding that. I wanted desperately to be able to talk about it, but I didn't have a vocabulary for it. So there's that, and then I realized that everything came to me first in images. I think everyone's, and how they say, how do you remember something? So I remember something visually first, and then I attach the language to that. So that was that process, and then again, that's a practical portion of this was that my mother would very generously ask me what I thought, and again, I didn't have the vocabulary for it, but what that did is she probably didn't even realize it, and I don't know if I ever told her this, but it set up my ability to feel safe to use my intuitive intellect. So that's how I function, and that's how I functioned as an editor too. I'm a little bit ADHD. I was a big athlete when I was young. You could not stop me. I couldn't sit still in school. But it's how my brain functions too. So when I edit someone's book, I spread the entire book out on the bed, and I look at it as a large problem-solving puzzle. And so this is also, poetry is an art of collage in some ways, if you think about it. It doesn't come always in a linear fashion. When even our memory doesn't come to us in order. It comes in scenes, in snippets, and so that for me that's relates to like the image of these people on the horse. You know, I could say to you, well, look at that photograph, and I bet you could write a poem from that, or you could write a story. You could imagine what comes next. And I think also just selfishly, because my brother was also an artist, and my mother was an abstract painter, I wanted something of my own. So at 14, I decided I was going to be a writer.
Fantastic, thank you. I noticed a term you had brought up, and I'd read it in other interviews you had had, and I wanted to ask further. You speak of an intuitive intellect, and to my mind, it's like intuition really does feed into poetry, but how is that different perhaps from other forms of intellect? And do you think intuitive intellect is the most fundamental for poetry and that form of expression?
I think it's the fundamental form of being human. I think we're taught away from using our brains in a certain way. There was this psychologist, I think his name is Heinz Werner. He had a very old book that's no longer available, but it was called The Psychology of Mental Development. And he said that children under the age of 5, schizophrenics, truly primitive cultures, and poets all thought in the same way, which is to say that they didn't separate themselves from the environment that they were in. Children use a lot of synesthesia and personification, you know, like they'll say, the table grabbed my leg, you know, that kind of thing. So I and my father believed this too, that he said there wasn't enough recognition about kinesthetic intelligence, which is what athletes have. You know, our brains function in so many ways, because if you think about it, we're constantly perceiving, like I'm perceiving this room while I'm talking to you, but I'm also seeing in my mind things that I want to try to remember. And so, what was your question?
You just keep talking. I don't remember the full thing. The theme was intuitive intellect, but the rest.
Oh yeah. So the thing about poetry that we can remind ourselves of is that the great thing about poetry is that we associate, and then we reassociate, and then we reassociate. So little children will say, well, what did it look like? And they'd say, you know, he looked like a mountain or something, or he looked like, no, that's not a good example. He looked like a rock. And then they'll say, well, how big was the rock? Where is the rock? What's happening around the rock? See, so you keep extending the story. And it's interesting, most of my books are written with a lot of research. I did a lot of, like for Mask, those are all persona poems. And I did a lot of researching history of words, because I don't know if it was my way, again, of avoiding talking about real life, but I believe that whatever poem you choose, and this also relates to film, when we are the character, the voice of the poem is the character, you're the principal character. And what you choose to write about tells us a lot about you. So it's like that is the natural subtext of certain things that's going on in your inner life. Because your inner life is very different from how you're reacting to the exterior world. So I think that even if you're writing, let's say, a very political poem that's about Bozo the Clown, that's what I call him, sorry, and it has a lot of detail that's about his world, there's still something in your life that's informing that poem. There's something in you emotionally that's informing that poem. And that takes us to the realm of the natural world. We can all, I'm sure everyone in this room can say they, at some point in time, included the natural world in their writing and in their thinking. So, one of the best examples of this is Brokeback Mountain. It's based on I can't pronounce French, Annie Proulx's short story about Brokeback Mountain. It's only a few pages, and they made that entire film. But one of the principal things in the story that I recognized was that that the landscapes and the weather mirrored the emotional landscape of the characters. So, and there's another thing, the texture of your writing, the sounds, all of it is this one big cauldron that you have, and again, it's part of that larger problem-solving adventure. And I forgot what you asked. So
That was a wonderful
square
answer.
one.
Yeah, thank you so much again. I have one other question before we open up. That I think I've noticed, you were speaking about your experience with, your half-sister's passing, and that she re-emerges in each collection, or often, and in a few of your images you have floor smells like old beer and grief, and then you have the table under the table. How does writing the poems and coming up with these sorts of metaphors and images change your relationship or alter your relationship to that grief or whatever other emotions come up from it?
So also grief is one of our, I think, everyone, it's there, it's always there, it never goes away. And I believe that grief occupies our bodies, but as time goes on, it occupies our bodies differently. And it has an effect on us differently. We have to learn to live with it, or we don't. But so then you start, here's something that I realized. When my son was very sick and went into the hospital, at one point we thought he had cancer. He didn't, thank God. But during the 2 weeks before we found out whether he had cancer, everything that I saw was different. You've heard that expression, it colored the outside world for me. So suddenly things were very much in focus, and other things just disappeared from my peripheral vision. So I think about that's what we do in poetry. If we revisit something emotionally, we can allow ourselves then to project and retranslate, because poetry is the act of translation. So we're retranslating over and over that experience, and as the experience evolves within our lifetime, so does the language and the way to express it and address it. But also, and I'll use again a film term, you have principal characters and something's going on. You're not going to always have one camera angle. There's going to be camera angles from above, there's going to be close-ups, and the camera is going to be a very important part of how we, the viewers, experience that. And also as an actor, we're like method actors. We get to we research the part, even if it's a part of remembering ourselves as in childhood. We have to go back and think about it. Okay, what do I see? What was in the room? What objects, even especially ordinary objects, I love, because ordinary objects take on unusual qualities in your memory when in relation to something happy or sad, or all the million other emotions that we have. But yeah, I think that's it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and as you were saying,
I could go on and on. I start to reassociate.
Yeah, that's it. Translate. Yeah, and the ordinary objects, it sounds like they become symbols in.
They do. They are. They're symbolic, and we have our own personal mythology.
Yeah.
Yeah, related to them. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. So, questions. Yeah, I'll leave this with you.
I do writing, and I do art quilting, and I've written a couple of films for the hell of it. And
Very cool.
And I do all different kinds of art, and I appreciate what you have to say. And I know in writing classes they always say, write what you know. I know that there's also personal traumas, like some that I've had that were so severe that it took many, many years before they'd resurface. And they'd resurface as an image that I could slowly peel away, because had the whole thing come to me, it would have overwhelmed. But it sounds like that's a big part of my life and your life. And how do you think, if you, led a perfect life. I'm not clear that you would be able to write poetry or do a lot of, because it seems that it emotionally fuels you and it changes your lens, and you can see that your lens is changing.
It does. And going back to that adage that we've all heard, write what you know, it doesn't mean that the whole poem has to be about that one thing.
But
And
it's
again,
an emotion, you know.
again, you know, you can go back and you can look at a description. Let's say it's an eco poem, an eco poetry poem, and I bet if you thought about it for a while, there might be one small thing that ties you to that moment, and sometimes that's enough. That's all you need is one mention of, like, why I ended up remembering that when I gave the woman who was walking down the street directions, and then she tried to cross the highway and got hit. I mean, I remember that because it was very upsetting. But why I tied that to Andrew Wyeth's paintings, it started with, you know, the famous one where the woman's in, I've forgotten her name now, the woman in the field, and Christine, and then I started to think about, again, the physiological nature of that's also the take on different aspects throughout our lives. I mean, and there again, you know, it's kind of that cliche, you get 10 people witnessing an accident, you're going to get 10 different versions.
Or 12.
Well, the same thing throughout your life. You're going to have many, many different versions of the truth. I think it was Kafka who said the truth is alive and therefore has a lively changing face. Yeah, that's but I think allow yourself to get messy and write as much as you can, and then, you know, because these newer poems evolved out of failed poems that I threw away basically, and then I thought, okay, I'm going to go back and visit those and figure out what maybe they were about. Again, it's like you have to pretend, you have to stand back for a moment and pretend like you didn't write it. Say, what's going on there? Who's in the picture? All of those things. Yeah, it's fun. I can't get enough, and I also believe that there's a very important interrelationship between all the arts. So might as well take it all in.
Right.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah.
So can you just talk about like your process? Like, are you one of those warrior writers and you like, okay, I'm at my desk, you know, at this time and I'm gonna write, or you just let it happen, and do you officially, so that's like a two-part question, the second part, do you consider yourself like a professional poet?
I do, and I probably would, you know, it's interesting when you say that, because I think when I was hired as the regional director of the Poetry Society of America, my first book had not come out. Now, there's several reasons that happened. I knew a lot of poets. I graduated from Sarah Lawrence. I got into a lot of graduate schools, and I wrote. I had published a lot of individual poems, and I wrote essays and really good. I would write these book review style introductions for every poet. So I found out about that. But it definitely felt like an imposter syndrome. I had terrible anxiety about it. But with that too, you know, it was very hard on myself. I kept thinking, the first book's not ready. No, it's not. You know, and you can kind of drag your heels in that. But I think it's, you know, if you love something that makes you, it's a part of you. It's like, I like to say too that language is an appendage. It's a sixth sense for us. You know, it really is. It has a very important function. Even if it's something like you want to describe, you want to be able to convince someone that you love them, ask them to marry you, or you want to be able to describe your feelings to someone, or you want to ask for a job interview. All of this is, you know, it's, again, I believe it's physical. And Robert Hass, one of our former poet laureates, said, you know, poetry is literally the movement of breath. And Shakespeare was one of the first to put that breath in us, because all of his poems were in iambic pentameter. It's like the heartbeat. Da, 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 da. But I think, I have 5 books and I feel like I'm just starting. I wish I wasn't so old. Which I feel about the screenwriting too. I had no idea that I could write dialogue. That was a real risk. I got an MFA in screenwriting in 2022. So I was really taking a chance there, but I love it. And I think because I love language. My God, in another life I would, and I'm very envious of people that can speak multiple languages. Because every language has particular aspects to it that's unique to that language. So you could just think of your poetry as that way, as a second language that you're speaking. So I keep wanting to hand it.
I'll just lead the way every time you do it.
I have a question. So I'm so interested and curious about when you say they were failed poems, because I've been to other readings of yours, and this was so good and so powerful. I love these poems. So tell me why you considered them failed. Like, I'm sure it's a very broad question.
Either, well, as you know, a lot of my work is very dense and sometimes very abstract, or it was. I'm trying not to do that anymore, just for my own sake, because it's like when you try something new, it's like getting with a trainer and you suddenly discover you have muscles you didn't even know you had, but I'm gonna also, I'm sorry, I'm like the queen of quotes, but I'm also gonna quote a poet you might not know, but he was very famous when I was starting out at Sarah Lawrence, Michael Ryan. And he said, a poet has a way of failing that later, I'm paraphrasing, but that later becomes what succeeds.
That's what I'm thinking listening to these poems. I don't know how much you reworked them, the originals that you say.
Yeah, I mean, I think also being an editor has really helped me. So, because I often like to say, okay, who's there? Again, where are we? What are the objects that you've chosen? What are the physical, what's the physical nature of the poem? What are the actions? And are the actions, the series of actions, getting us to that final point? Now, a poem's more like a scene, unless it's a really long poem. But, you can kind of tell. You can tell if the poem is engaging, if it has energy, if you can, even directors, they can put too much of their hand in it. It's like they're forcing you to feel something, or, and similarly, some poems do that. I'm like, no. So, but also, yeah, I'm just very hard on myself, and they just fell down. But thank goodness I saved them, because so many of them I didn't even remember, and I went back and thought, oh, okay. And one of the things that I like to do, and he'll know this, is I was recently, and I know she won't mind saying, was recently working with Kelly Russell Agaddon, and she gave me more than a manuscript. She gave me like enough for 2 manuscripts, and I showed her how, because as an artist, even if you change the way you paint or the way you work with material, it's eventually you're going to find that some of the color palette is going to be, you're going to keep returning to. Certain objects you're going to keep returning to. I have to be very careful not to mention mouths and birds and water. But these things, there's a reason for that. And so we, it's part of our own very private vocabulary. So I was happy to see, things that I didn't remember, and I saw that there were some similarities, but I wanted to rework it. And again, it's about like finding a double connection, finding a connection with something personal, but also finding a connection to the thing itself, because it has its own life. My first professor, Thomas Lux, who was so brilliant, first teacher, said, once you write the poem, it no longer belongs to you. So, yeah.
One more question before we break? Yeah.
What did you mean by intuitive intellect? I didn't quite understand that.
Like free association, finding, like allowing your mind to put disparate things together, you know, because that's you know, it's juxtapositions especially, or metaphor, is very much, I think, based in the intuitive intellect. It's like we do, now they say, the scientists say, my daughter got very grumpy with me about this, but scientists say that memories don't actually live in your brain, that there's something happens that makes you trigger the brain in a way that fires the brain to bringing the memory back. But I'll say, we have a warehouse in there. We have a warehouse, and so you're trying to access it. One of the things, for you probably saw one of my old interviews, is I used to rock when I first started writing, because I felt like I was rowing toward my subject. I kept thinking, okay, I can feel it, I can see it, I think I know where I'm going, I'm not sure. A lot of writers, including another former poet laureate, Stanley Kunitz, who was so amazing in being able to speak about poetry, but like he said, words are so erotic. They never tire of their coupling. But he said, you know, a lot of writers don't know what they're going to write about until they get into the poem. You don't know what your memory is going to be like until you get into the memory, you know, so that's, to me, what the intuitive intellect does. It's not rote learning. It doesn't go from, you know, linear, it doesn't have a linear path. My brain certainly does not follow a linear path, so, but you know, it's interesting, it's a survival technique if you think about it. As children, I think we realize certain things, vulnerabilities that we have, and either we can flounder in it, or we can try to use that to work, you know, like I used my athletic prowess to survive the death in the family and how it was impacting. I was able to, and this is, I don't mean to make it light, this was a way of getting my yayas out. I was able to physically work through my grief and my frustration and all of those things. So I think children, you know, I think we naturally kind of gravitate. I think that Rilke, I'll end with this. So we have an amazing poet in the audience, Lois P. Jones, and also a Rilke expert. I know she doesn't like it when I say that, but so in his letters, letters on Cézanne, and again I'm paraphrasing, he said, but every artist works until they get to the point where it's the necessary, irrepressible, definitive utterance of the self that must be, something like that. The necessary, irrepressible. It's like you can't, you have to have it, you have to do it, you feel it, you have to let it out. And that's not to say that art is therapy, but it's certainly, I think we're very lucky to have our art. I don't know if you felt that way during COVID, but I was thinking about people that didn't have a relationship to the imagination or to, you know, something personal that they could escape with. You know, it's certainly, you know, because COVID was a time when we had to escape with our art and our loved ones.
Yeah. All right. And just very quickly, where can we find your books? Where can we find your editing services?
I apologize. I went to look. Well, you'll see my books in the back, but those are my last copies. That I literally only have one copy of each book. So I'm going to write down my website, and you can either order it directly through me at a discount, or you can order it through my different publishers. It's Omnidon and Tupelo Press and What Books Press. The first book, Flammable Bird, Tupelo Press bought up all the remainders of that, so they have both Flammable Bird and Mask. And then No Don't. I'm having fun with these titles. No Don't is basically a long chapbook, just from poems that I abandoned. But I thought, well, they're sad. I should do something about it. And thank you so much for braving the rain and for being here.
All right, thank you.
Lovely audience.
Thank you, Elena.